All right, welcome back to Comic. It said Comic Talk. Today we're going to be talking about the wonderful world of psychic powers. And I gotta admit there's some weird stuff out out there. Most people would think it'd be kind of interesting, to lift objects with their mind. It's actually read other people's minds, but there definitely are some caveats to each one of them, and I'll go into. So starting with one of the most basic of things is telekinesis. Essentially, instead of lifting objects with your mind, although the way they kind of portray everything in movies, they always show people, waving their hands around instead to direct their flow rather than just simply, you know, having something appear, from off camera with no visible signs of it's there. I mean, if you ever saw the first X-Men movie, they showed her, Jean Grey, actually holding up her hand to block uh, his head to try to stop, Toad, but yet it would seem like if she's supposed to be as powerful during everything being kind of controlled, she would just simply would just kind of give him a look like, and then that's what it would be, and just blast it around. So that could definitely be one way of putting it. You may also would say, force users. It seems as though, like even in The Empire Strikes Back, they actually showed Yoda actually having to move his hand to actually get the X-wing out of the muck. Yet later on, Vader just seemed to be able to just were just kind of not even looking at anything, was just kind of just staring at Luke, and he was able to throw things at him. You could possibly and back at that time they didn't know exactly what made Vader so powerful, and so you could possibly would say everyone could have some decent, um, slightly different levels of control that may not be as effective. In this case, so another caveat might be that he said, "Are you someone that maybe that lights up objects when you're actually are whether being influenced by your psionic field, like in Pokemon, because techniques like confusion and psychic always show, glowing eyes, and then you slightly glow around you, so it's obvious. So if you're trying to be, sneaky, let's say trying to lift something, especially like during the middle of the night, it might as well be like having a gigantic signal that says, "Hey, look what I'm doing." So and maybe some short range abilities, like what they showed in Looper, with that little coin trick. That would probably hardly be much of anything. But if someone um, has to say, let's say, well, say that there are some very heavy, fallen trees around, and it's in the kind of in the broad, it has to get everything. That might definitely would show an increased amount of power over time. Um, so essentially, so it really would just kind of would depend upon whatever you have. Then again, another way of actually, and while in this case, like with the energy, it's a natural energy that I mentioned in the previous video, it is technically essentially, using that, basically using psychic gel, which may or may not be visible, for various purposes. Um, and even then, um, you know, you said there's no telling how much of a range you might actually have. It's one thing to say, yes, I can lift this, 200-pound object, and move it around, but if it's a little too far, then like your body weight, it's a body length, it starts to actually falter, like, you're not actually lifting, that you're lifting an object much, said that's a lot heavier. So, and even then, your actual total amount of what you can lift may in fact be derived from what how much you weigh, kind of like that, like having the influence of a planet with so many moons. I mean, in theory, Venus is large enough to definitely have a moon of its own, but would still be able to have it because yet it doesn't. Just as in this case, Mars technically has those two random asteroids, floating around it, and yet it's smaller than Earth. Actually, it said it's smaller than Earth. So, and you just never know, what kind of strain it actually would be, because um, it is essentially mostly what you're doing with telekinetics is lifting things without making physical contact. So it said not saying that you couldn't actually touch an object and lift it. It would be kind of like an anti-gravity tag. Essentially, you're channeling the energy through something, and you can move it around like that. But maybe, um, and the question is, how much more can you actually lift? And but then again, you would need to worry about the issues of if you're trying to catch something, slowing down inertia, because everything is still going to move. And one thing they actually did right with Brandon Routh's Superman, and eventually with Henry Cavill's, was the fact they kind of showed that everything floating around him, and that's just known as tactical telekinetics, that would allow for a wave of psychic energy to be manipulated all throughout a structure such as the falling, um, I said, airplane. So the fact that it doesn't just immediately crush on everything. Just like anyone who's ever been in a difficult car situation where you had to slam on the brakes quite a bit, you're still going to move forward. It's pretty much the exact same thing. Even within this case, various forms of hyperspace, they have to have some type of inertial dampeners to actually make sure you're not being squashed. Because if essentially you're using ludicrous speed from Spaceballs, it seemed like they were able to go that fast, but it wasn't, quite what someone um, was actually meant to maintain. Almost as though it was almost like feeling regular hyperspace with not as many dampeners. That's kind of why they always say, hold on to something, and then so it seems like once they're actually in hyperspace, everything is fine. But that initial burst is definitely an issue, because in this case, you want to make sure that you are lifting something, and if you have to fall, it'll be there. Because anyone knows anything about Spider-Man knows that when he accidentally killed Gwen Stacy was just the fact that he was able to catch her, but the whiplash was too much. And yeah, that definitely is a bit of an issue, because if there isn't anything really to kind of protect you, you're still going to be you're falling at a pretty sizable rate of speed from a very good height. There's not really much that can be done to protect you unless you have something to almost kind of go in front of you and push back in a safe way, almost as though slowly reducing the gravitational pull until the point where it doesn't hurt you as much. Because when they actually talked about like flying frogs, when they kind of glide through the air and they eventually land, they're they don't really they're not really affected, because they always say like the bigger they are, the harder they fall, because there's just not as much force acting on them. And one thing definitely would say is that um, something kind of like what Magneto does is not the same type of telekinetics. He actually has to find something metal to actually balance with. This is because that's just what he's known for. It's not like saying, "Hey, could you pick me up? That glass bottle is said off the counter, or something else is not made." It seems like he's only able to use metal, because they do conduct. You know, they are definitely very conductive, and even if they're not meant to be entirely magnetic, on their own, metal is metal. So that's what he only does. And basically proving that his powers are somewhat finite was actually what was in X-Men 2, when he was when he was breaking out of prison. They said there was a little sign on the floor that said 100-foot drop, yet he said almost as though they knew how high he could essentially levitate himself. And so in this case, he needed the metal to actually go through. So essentially, if you are able to levitate yourself, the question is, you know, how is it going to be different than what you could do if you're able to run, and how high could you actually go? Because essentially, if it's not the same type of flying potential, no matter how good of telekinetics you actually have, it seems to be a totally different thing. Because you would think more people, in the Star Wars universe would learn to actually, float, around to move things very quickly. And the closest thing I think we ever saw was Ray meditating, which in this case, and that's just, only going up so high and you're not moving. Essentially, you're pretty much just putting yourself into a bubble and seeing how well that bubble can be moved by you. So, and even then, you don't want to be, you know, influenced by other forces that would make it hard to fly, such as if you get a little too emotional and you can't concentrate, that might be a bit of an issue rather than just actually just casually flying for And sadly, I don't think there are too many like really fast, levitators in comic book worlds. And I said if there are, we would really like to see them. I said see them, but there's always has to be some other kind of force, like the idea of like gravitational manipulation. That would probably be a bit more, but they often show a force field. The idea is that with a lot of psychic energies, it's just you. There's no extra theatrics, to make everything work. It might as well be, yes, these are the invisible wires that allow me to float, instead float. So another kind of thing a lot of people may think is like cool would be telepathy, and there's a lot of problems that can go wrong with it. One is what exactly are you using? What kind of telepathy are you talking about? Because it's one thing to just be able to read someone's mind, and you know that's pretty much a kind of a casual thing. You could basically just pick up on someone's thoughts. That's one thing. But are you someone that's actually able to project your voice outwards, without even moving your lips? Because in one sense, you could either have, like you're just being able to just project your energy around you, and so the fact that it sounds like you're still talking to someone, and so or like you're doing ventriloquism rather than going into someone's head, to actually send the message. Because you know that might be the one dangerous amount of intrusive parts. Because in theory, you know, what you're actually could be reading off of someone's thoughts may just be outward projections of everything, and you just can read them rather than actually trying to, really go into someone's, thoughts. There it seems to be quite, very hard to read. At the best of times, it's almost as though you have to really dig, break down a lot of barriers. And the question is, can you break down those barriers without getting noticed? In this case, if you're talking about a weird type of, basically the weird, um, like telepathy that doesn't quite work, was actually in an episode of Dexter's Laboratory where he's trying to find out what his dad got him for his birthday. So he used a device that made him, was supposed to read minds, but it was almost like everyone else said he was able to project his own thoughts, even by accident. It was just like, that's what he was. It wasn't like, a voice inside of something, tickling, right? Because in this case, that would just be the equivalent of, you're just having a private conversation. You don't want to have other people picking up on things. So if you are going to read minds, it said humans are definitely one thing, but if you're surrounded by a lot of animals, there's no telling what they may be able to use, especially if there are a lot of very active things, or like in a Disney princess movie where they can't actually, talk. They still have their own little thoughts, and picking up on anything might be impossible. They said it might be very difficult with so many minds going at once, and then if they don't somehow understand what English or whatever language you have is, it's just going to sound like a lot of white noise. And Listening to too many voices at once could be daunting. And then if you're someone like Professor X, it seems like he's able to hear a lot of voices from a very far distance. Kind of like what happened in Bruce Almighty when he like heard all the prayers of everyone at once. It just seemed to be way too much. That would also be a really big problem. And so then the only reason why I would say maybe telepathy might be somewhat more helpful would be if you're underwater because humans can't, process information in the same way. In this case, you may have mouths, but maybe, the vocal cords are not able to function without air. So that's pretty much what you would have. But even then, it's like the most casual of thought could be projected by accident. Um, so another particular trick, a lot of people might think would be some degree of hypnosis or said to control people. That definitely would have way too many ramifications. Th- it's one thing to just say, okay, look into my eyes and fall asleep, and you could, give people a pretty good rest. But to plant everything in them requires, some knowledge of whether or not someone can be hypnotized with anything. Because I saw a hypnotist one time that was able to convince a lot of make them do a lot of things, but every so often he would ask one of the people on stage to leave, like for some reason they weren't really processing everything as much. So even if there is, the power of suggestion is one thing, you know, there could still be on some level, some kind of control that would say, okay, I'm not going to walk off this very tall cliff, I said, or plunge my hands in fire because that's just what they do. It's not the Imperious Curse. And even then, it seems like, what was the Spire was being tortured. Essentially, there was some degree of self-preservation on that, and that might be the one thing that might be of a problem for a lot of people. And while you may be able to project, images of someone instead of something in front of people, the question is, if no one, if you're in a very crowded situation and you try to convince people that a tiger is right in front of them, it it said, but no one else is reacting. It's like, okay, that's not real. And even then, it's like you would have to make it real. Would be you would have to know a lot more about what a tiger feels like, what it sounds. Maybe even it smells. There's just a lot of weird stuff to make people think that something is actually there. Kind of like when they have like fake outs of things, and just the fact that if no one reacts or anything, and there's an awkward loop of something, it's not gonna fool anyone. It's not gonna fool anyone for very long, especially if everyone like you're basically trying way too hard to actually make everything work. It's like when they showed like James McAvoy's version, like you always had to basically touch his temple to make everything work. So, if that's like the universal sign for most telepathic users, that is definitely going to be an issue. But then again, you also have to see, are you only projecting it for one person, or is it just like, sending a message? Like, okay, everyone can see this thing, like it is there, but in theory, if someone tries to touch it, it's not going to move. It's almost like sending like that corporeal or talking Patronus charms. It's like, yes, this is the message, and then you just kind of vanish afterwards. So trying to make sure everyone understands, gets everything could be an issue, especially if you're having to talk with everything from miles away, and that's just a nightmare. But a few other things that psychic energy can actually do is creates some harder constructs. Um, in this case, it's just the equivalent of just binding all the psychic energy at once. So it eventually starts becoming visible. If anyone's seen X-Men Apocalypse, when Psylocke had her blade, that's just what it is. She is a very good psychic character, but she produces a psionic energy inside dagger that's pretty impressive. So while this is almost as though while you might be able to block things with telekinetics by essentially putting a counter, force against them. So it's like hitting a brick wall. It said sometimes you don't really want. You said some things might be a little too dangerous. Like very high caliber bullets with other that are going way too fast, or trying to block some type of chemicals from hitting people. Because maybe in this case, this it said the barrier um, is definitely there, but it's almost like if you can feel what you're actually touching, to know don't touch it again, that might be a problem. Because last thing you want to do is have a massive thing of hydrochloric acid, touch you at the wrong time, and you essentially create kind of psychic burns, almost like if you're trapped in the matrix, your brain makes it real. So regardless of whatever, how powerful you actually are, if you perceive, something that's very dangerous, to you, it may not be what you would want. But but in this case, this energy can be used, to create like energy orbs as well for basic attacks. Some characters even have like a thought blaster that seems to be pretty impressive, um, which isn't too bad, to work everything because you don't want to just be think that okay, yeah, you're just some guy with a weird brain who can't really protect themselves. You do need a way to concentrate, a greater amount of energy to deal with opponents that may also have powers as well. And because you never know what kind of things would call for everything. Because um, one of the other Spider Women in the world, in the Marvel Universe, Julia Carpenter, portrayed by uh, Sydney Sweeney, her webs were actually psionic. They functioned just like that, but was almost just like everything. She didn't have to worry about cleanup or anything. It was just the fact that she was able to control it, to make shapes of what she needed to. Yet, you know, it still was able to feel sticky and trap characters. Yet it could just vanish in an instant, like no waiting for everything to dissolve. And but possibly one of the most dangerous psychic powers to actually have is clairvoyance. Because one, you said there's no telling what you could see either intentionally or by accident. Because if you're talking about having the limited clairvoyance of Nicolas Cage in the movie Next, is he only had you could only see a few minutes ahead, unless you're talking about with something involving Jessica Biel, either being around or just thoughts of her, or it said so you can't really push anything, so far that anything might work. In this case, might cause some of that damage, like what they showed in Stranger Things. It's almost like you're literally trying to, your brain builds up too much pressure, it's going to bleed you from the inside out. And even then, if you could see something a bit farther, the question is, what exactly would cause that to be triggered? Because when they actually had the series That's So Raven, she would often get the most random of visions at once, and essentially she couldn't control it, you know, I said really at all. Of course, then I stopped watching it when I lost cable, but there was a moment where she essentially um, was in a volleyball game and she had an awkward look, and all of a sudden, she missed, a play. It was like, what the heck? What was it? And all it really was just the fact that because of an argument with her friend Chelsea, she broke, and said she broke a nail. It's not so much like when they actually had an episode where um, their male friend Eddie temporarily gained psychic powers, and he fell in with someone that was actually secretly gambling, and essentially, but they were shown, but everything was saved just because she saw the vision off screen and were able to kind of protect them. So if you can't actually control the future or what you see, it's going to be a problem. And even then, like what they said next, if you look at the future, it changes because you looked at it. So it's not like, and you don't even know if something is what may happen or what will happen regardless. Because, there's always that trope of people trying to fix, fix the past, and it's something they do while trying to make everything better that causes the biggest problem. So, well, but something like Spider-Man Spider Sense, that's perfectly fine because it allows you to perceive the world around you, to alert for immediate danger, and it often seems as though that it can occur, quite well. And then they actually showed like Far From Home, he eventually, was able to kind of, control it no problem and for a little while. But if you're trying to, someone says, okay, what's the next big lottery, jackpot, you know, it says that could definitely be a problem because once you use your powers like that once, and people find out about it, they're not going to let you have a normal life ever again. Essentially, that if you flaunt whatever you can do, it's gonna end poorly. Kind of like when Richard Pryor in Superman 3 figure out a way to acquire a small fortune from the computer company he was working for just by collecting the various random um, partial cents that were hidden within it, and yet it was still able to be identified from everything. It was like, here's the total amount of said money, and but it said it was made up of a bunch of very, very small ones, kind of like the idea of saying if this was Harry Potter, it's like, yeah, we're missing 1,000 galleons, but all Richard Pryor did was pick up Canuck coins, one at a time until he got everything he wanted, and then he immediately bought himself a very fancy car like there was no issue. And yet and they manipulated him into basically, um, to use his newly discovered computer skills to figure out what kryptonite was actually made out of to deal with Superman. So once you kind of have those, you know, visions, it's not really going to be very helpful. And while in this case, some people may be able to see, we talk about being able to see the past through various, interactions. The question is, you know, are you talking about the immediate past that may happen a few hours ago, or are you essentially watching what amounts to someone's life flashing before your eyes, and so before their eyes in a weird montage? Because if the real important stuff actually happened just beyond your range, it's not exactly going to be the most. It may not be as helpful because every second we move forward into the future, it's 1 second far. The past gets away from us. So other psychic powers I know of is there's certain versions of pyrokinesis. It may not really be anything like an insane, flame on power, but if you can essentially just create like little lights said on the tip of your fingers to light candles and other things, that is still you've actually made fire. Some people can say, hey, I can make fire, with just my chi, and that is definitely possible. But it's one thing to basically just simply, flip up your finger, like it's saying it, just burn it like that. And whether or not you'll be able to essentially create an entire heat wave around you could be different, could be very different. Um, could be up for debate. I know there's also seismokinetic, um, which essentially means you can actually create small earthquakes with whatever you use. Um, Everything could definitely be very different because different on that one. I mean, especially if you're in a place that has a lot of fault lines, like if you're in California, said, or they recently had some a big earthquake out in Tennessee. So that's one thing to basically trigger that kind of force in you. But it's almost like people would say, well, could you do that with telekinetics? It's possible, but it's almost as though saying no, you only have power over the earth. And essentially, this is what you could say happened in the last Airbender series because they always with it seemed like they were telekinetically lifting their chosen element, although firebending was only rarely shown creating spurts either through a small amount of candles campfire, and then when they actually made, let's say, during a festival, because that's one of the things that made the pyrokinesis was definitely very different. They sort of feel feel the heat in them, and they would just simply would make it come out so fast that that was fire. But then again, that was definitely more of a chi based attack rather than psionic skills. So they could be close enough to be worked together, but unless you were like the Avatar, um, a massive, creating a massive blaze would not be in your power. So while in this case, people always would say, what about like psychic surgeons or something like that? I really don't know much. He said what people are trying to playing at. I mean, it's one thing for them to be able to, touch someone and say, okay, this is what's actually wrong with you. I'm going to basically draw on your skin and saying these are the areas that you're going to need to have. But it's not the same thing as just, faking, an incision with some dye and then pulling out, what they say is a tumor, which is nothing but a bunch of like chicken livers. So, yeah. I mean, you could possibly heal someone like, force healing, but the question is, if someone was that said they made it seem as though that power was just randomly appeared, and if everyone else knew about it, they would use it. So, like with any power, there is some degree of fear, like essentially, having that insane, control over the world around you could definitely be very dangerous on your own. So it's like, oh, this is a dark side power, and yet you guys seems to be able to determine, someone's fate at a moment's notice, like where you can kidnap, babies um, that were definitely um, not entirely normal. That definitely did have a link to the Force. It said, but then again, they made it seem as though that Yoke was actually watching Luke the entire time and was like, oh yeah, much anger in him. Like I said, he wasn't focused on what he was, on where he was, and like, but I'm thinking, you really know what he was doing on a terrible planet, okay? I said, what do you think he was going to actually do? And they made it seem as though that, like some comics would say, oh, I always wanted to train, Leia, and like she was made way too much of a public figure. It's like there was no common sense. You definitely would have the great powers in the mind, yet standard humanity will escape you every time. Okay, so that's all I have to say about that. The next video will actually be on the powers of stretching with, and actually that of shapeshifting. While they might be broken up into two spots because you can be a shapeshifter without being elastic and vice versa. So everyone have a good one and take care.